In this video, we will talk about gentrification in relation to heritage and to displacement. Gentrification is a term that you may have heard of. It is one of today's buzzwords and not just in urban studies. Gentrification was first coined by the British sociologist Ruth Glass in 1964, and this is how she described it. In short, gentrification means that a poorer, run-down neighborhood is changing due to an influx of wealthier people, which attracts investments, drives up rents, property values, changes facilities and social structures, and eventually pushes out original inhabitants. But how does this process usually work? We can dub the gentrification process, as described by Glass, as classic gentrification. Usually, this takes place in a few phases. At first, artists or cultural grassroots initiatives move into vacant buildings in a dilapidated neighborhood, looking for cheap housing. Buildings are reused, temporarily or more permanently. This makes the neighborhood interesting and draws new people and more activity. This attracts investments in infrastructure and built environment, as well as people who want to live in the neighborhood and new facilities to cater to those inhabitants. Then rents and property values start to rise. Original inhabitants can no longer afford the neighborhood and they are forced to move out. Social structures that may go back generations are slowly dissolving. That's how you end up with a gentrified neighborhood. Mind you, the classic gentrification process may not necessarily include all the mentioned phases. Gentrification takes on different forms in different contexts, with different actors involved, which are all a variation of Glass's classic gentrification. Inner city regeneration gentrification, suburban gentrification, rural gentrification, new build gentrification, when a neighborhood is newly constructed on, for example, agricultural land just outside an expanding city, commercial gentrification, super gentrification, when a neighborhood which was gentrified in the 1970s is experiencing a second wave of gentrification, displacing the first gentrifiers. Touristification, which refers to gentrification taking place when a neighborhood is beautified to attract tourists. If there are so many types of gentrification, then what differentiates it from just another form of urban development? No stress. Gentrification always has some fixed components. A lower income group is displaced by a wealthier income group as inhabitants of a neighborhood. The newcomers are often described as, or feel themselves, pioneers to a derelict neighborhood they settle in. Rents and property values rise, well above initial levels. Investments are made in infrastructure, green areas, and the built environment.
Gentrification can have positive and negative impacts for residents and neighborhoods. Some research show that improved built environment, improved housing conditions, and increased safety are among the positive impacts. Other scholars warn about the negative impacts, such as displacement, unaffordability, loss of social network, etc. Rather than labeling gentrification as good or bad, we should always investigate how different groups are influenced by gentrification. In other words, who benefits and loses as the result of gentrification. The role of governments in gentrification changed over time from simply providing facilities, infrastructure, to actively intervening to make neighborhoods attractive for private investors, developers, and affluent residents. In many cities, gentrification is embraced as a competitive urban strategy by policymakers who promote gentrification through flagship projects, social mixing, sales of housing, etc. Gentrification led by public actors is called state-led gentrification. The way we understand and conceptualize gentrification is often based on the experiences of classical gentrification in the cities of global north. After 2000s, scholars started questioning the applicability and usefulness of the term for the cities of global south. Some important questions were raised. Is there a global gentrification? Can gentrification as a concept capture diverse processes in different cities of global south, for instance, the renewal of central slum areas? Do we stretch the term gentrification if we apply it to understand forced evictions in informal settlements, for instance? Recently, Lees, Shin, and Morales discussed the presence of generalized gentrification, which they called as planetary gentrification. They understand the term gentrification flexibly to grasp contextual differences. Other scholars like Gärtner thinks that cities of global south need decolonized theories of urban change rather than simply applying gentrification theory. We can view gentrification from many different angles, but for now we focus on heritage and displacement. Displacement is a forced residential move induced by external forces or events beyond the control of the household. It can be induced by public interventions, such as urban renewal, or by market-based rent increases, for instance. Marcuse defined 4 types of displacement. Last resident displacement happens when the last household in a housing unit gets displaced due to rent increases or demolition. Secondly, chain displacement takes place when the former household of the same housing unit was also displaced. Thirdly, exclusionary displacement occurs when a housing unit located by a household becomes gentrified, thus unavailable and unaffordable for a similar type of household. The 4th type is displacement pressure. And displacement pressure is felt by residents who are not immediately displaced due to the unfavorable changes taking place in their neighborhood, such as neighbors moving out, decreasing safety, which make it less livable for residents. Tarlabaşı is a deprived inner-city neighborhood in Beyoğlu, Istanbul. In 2005, Beyoğlu municipality initiated a renewal project to build hotels, luxurious housing, offices in Tarlabaşı, which caused massive displacement and dispossession. Displacement took many years, resulting in an eroding community, dispersal of social networks, decreased safety, closure of local shops, and more. Relatively big property owners benefited from the project, whereas small property owners, tenants, and squatters suffered from increased housing costs, loss of jobs, and networks. Renewal area physically improved after the intervention. But the question is, for whom?
When Glass first described gentrification in London, she wrote about 19th century neighborhoods. Scholars such as Sharon Zukin, David Lee, and John Caulfield researched the correlation between gentrification and historical buildings in the 1980s and 90s. They concluded that historical buildings attract new inhabitants. The restoration or heritage designation of these buildings is considered an improvement to a changing neighborhood. Heritage designation causes a new wave of gentrification and thus of unaffordability. Unfortunately, restored historical neighborhoods often lose their authenticity, becoming uniform or even sterile. Let's move to Indonesia for an example. Kota Tua is the historical inner city of its capital, Jakarta, formerly known as Batavia. It was constructed in 1619 by the Dutch East India Company as a hub for spice trade. Many of the colonial buildings are still there, but a lot of them are in bad shape. In 1970, the area was designated as Heritage Area in an attempt to attract tourists. New buildings were opened within colonial buildings, but furthermore, not much changed. Only in the last 15 years, the area has started to revitalize by mainly privately and some publicly initiated restoration projects. Public spaces have been pedestrianized, new cafes and shops are opening, and increasingly people are starting to enjoy spending time in Kota Tua. Although changes like this usually indicate gentrification is taking place, this still needs to be confirmed through further research.